We continue with our series. Okay. Yes, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching this. This is the second part or installment to the series Storytelling in the Bible, namely, how the way the story is told in the Bible says a great deal about what the story means, what the story is trying to convey, what the themes are of the story. And we did that last session with the two stories of creation, what was said and what wasn't said, and how that affected the meaning of the story. Well, today we're dealing with the Book of Ruth. Actually, the more correct term is the Scroll of Ruth. Ruth is one of the 5 biblical scrolls, and maybe it's called the Scroll of Ruth instead of the Book of Ruth because of its relative shortness and how it could fit more easily on a section of scroll. I don't know. But the tradition is there are 5 scrolls, and one of them is the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth is a short story. It's 4 chapters, but I don't want to give you the misimpression. The biblical author did not divide the story up into chapters. That was done, maybe 1,000 years later for the purposes of transmitting the Bible, printing the Bible, etc. But the number of verses is short, relatively short. So we'll call it a short story, but it isn't just the length. There are relatively few episodes, especially when you compare it to the stories of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis, where you have all sorts of things going on, or the books of the prophets, where it's very many messages are conveyed. But the Scroll of Ruth has relatively few episodes, relatively few characters, short story. But in addition to calling it a short story, I would call it by another more specific term, an idyll, I-D-Y-L-L, an idyll, which has nothing to do with having nothing to do and twiddling your thumbs. Not that kind of idyll. An idyll is a poem or story, usually short, with a rustic setting. Either it takes place out in the fields, especially in the case of Ruth. In the Song of Songs, a lot takes place in the fields, a lot takes place with the sheep and the goats. In that case, it's called a pastoral setting, but rustic covers both. Actually, this kind of setting and this kind of literary type is sometimes called a bucolic, a pastoral setting, a countryside setting, a rustic setting. More than a short story and an idyll, the Book of Ruth is what I would call a good feelings book, a good feelings story. When you finish it, you feel terrific. You feel good because all through the story, there are things to make you feel good. It's a story about good things happening to good people. Good things happening to good people. We've heard a lot about the other when bad things happen to good people. Well, this is good people and good things happening to them, which is a very nice match and very comforting and very reassuring and very optimistic. You start off in the Book of Ruth with one crisis after another. There is famine. There is death. There is the loss of one's ancestral lands. But the nice thing about the Book of Ruth is, by the time you've finished this short scroll, this short book, to borrow a phrase from the immortal bard Shakespeare, all's well that ends well, and everything does end well. It's a feel-good story. Let me give you a brief summary of the story, and if I leave a few things out in the course of the discussion, they'll come up and complete the story. We have a family living in Judah. Husband Elimelech, his wife Naomi, their two sons, Machlon and Chilion, and their wives, the wives of the two sons, who are both Moabite women. Moab is located approximately where Jordan is today, the kingdom of Jordan. And what happens in short order, there's a famine in the land. And if that weren't bad enough, Elimelech, Naomi's husband and the father of Machlon and Chilion, Elimelech dies. In short order, Machlon and Chilion die. I don't mean to imply they die because of the famine. I don't know why they died. It's not specified. But we're left with a crisis of nothing to eat. The land, you have to leave. You have to leave your home because you'll starve. What is a famine? A famine is when drought comes and therefore the fields do not produce grain. There's no grain for making bread for you, and there's no grain for feeding your animals. In other words, it's a disaster. A famine is a disaster. Famines were not unusual in the land of Israel because there the rainfall is based on a very delicate balance. The rains must start at a certain time and must end at a certain time. If they start too early, it's wasted or you'll flood the fields. If the rains go on too long and the harvest hasn't been completed, then the crops in the field will rot because of the moisture, the excess moisture. So it must start at the right time, rainfall, and end at the right time. And by all means, it must come. It must not be withheld as in a drought. Well, okay, there's a famine in the land, and so Naomi and her two Moabite daughters-in-law move from Judah in the west right towards the Mediterranean, and they move east from Israel in what is Jordan. They're moving west. And they're hoping that things are better in Moab, and they probably are, because it's a different kind of climate and a different kind of rainfall situation. So there they are, they're in Moab. And they're the mother-in-law and the two daughters-in-law. Isn't it nice? This is a mother-in-law story where the mother-in-law is beloved by her daughters-in-law and beloved by gentle reader, and it's none of the mother-in-law jokes that are the staple of our form of humor sometimes. Anyway, Naomi hears that the famine is over. Why? Because the rainfall has come, and it's watering the crops, and there are crops to be harvested, and it's harvest time, and the harvest is going full speed ahead. We can go back to the land of Judah from the land of Moab. But Naomi says, look, I'm an old woman. My sons are dead. Your husbands are dead. You have a life in front of you. Why don't you stay here in your country, Moab? Find husbands, build a family, have a life. What kind of a life are you going to have traipsing around the country with your mother-in-law? You know, I gave two sons that became your husbands, but I'm an old woman now. I have no more sons to give. Why don't you stay here? And the way the story goes, Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, says, oh, no, don't ask me to go. But Naomi persists in arguing her case that she has nothing to offer these two girls. And so Orpah returns home to her family in Moab. All right. Ruth, on the other hand, decides she will stick with her mother-in-law through thick and thin. It doesn't matter that there's nothing in it for her. She wants to protect her mother-in-law. You know, a woman traveling alone from Moab to Judah or anywhere else at this period, the more people in the party, the more safety, the more security. And she's an old woman. She needs help. Ruth is prepared to give it to her. Whither thou goest, I shall go, the famous line. Your people shall be my people. Your God shall be my God. Ruth is prepared to convert to the religion of Israel. So they set out and they go and arrive in Judah. It's harvest time. Harvest time, especially after a period of drought, is a time of joy, a time of plenty, a time of community coming together. Everybody's in the fields and they're harvesting and they're eating and drinking, and it's a joyous time. And they arrive. Well, you know, they're not so joyous. Her husband, Ruth's husband is dead, and Naomi's husband is dead. Better? Okay. And so, you know, here they come in this wonderful, joyous harvest scene, and they're not in a joyous situation. But not for long. This is a story where good things happen to good people. they have to eat. And now there are crops in the field. And so now Naomi is going to send out Ruth to glean in the fields. Gleaning means that you go through the fields after the harvesters, the people who are hired by the owners of the land. After they've taken their share, stuff gets left over. Produce falls to the ground, grain falls to the ground. They're not going to run back and get every single grain of wheat or barley, actually. And so the poor in ancient Israel have the right. You're not doing them any favors. They have the God-given right to glean in the fields and to pick up whatever they can and live on it, even though they don't own that land. And they work harvesting what's left over, and they are able to profit from it. It's a very enlightened system. It isn't charity. It's a right, and they work for what they earn, and it is a divine gift in the sense of a law that looks out for the unfortunate and provides for them. Ruth goes out into the fields, and she ends up in a field that is owned by a man named Boaz. Now, she's going about her gleaning, her reaping what's left over, and Boaz says, "Who is she? I've never seen her around here before." He says, "Oh, don't you know who this is? This is Ruth, who has come back from the land of Moab with her mother-in-law, Naomi, and she's come back with her, and she's really a wonderful, giving, good person." And so Boaz says, "Well, make special arrangements for her, make sure she gets the best of everything, and let her partake of the food that the harvesters have, and, look out for her." She gleans, she brings the food home to Naomi. Naomi says, "Where were you today?" She says, "I was in a field of a man named Boaz, and he was so good to me. And here is all that I've gleaned, and he was just wonderful to me." And Naomi says, "Well, this Boaz is actually one of the kinsmen of Elimelech, my husband, and mine. And you really hit it just right." And he is just the right person for you to have connected with. Unbeknownst to you at the time, just happened that way. Well, Naomi tells Ruth, this is a person who can help us in ways other than just letting you glean in the field. This is a person that in biblical law is called a goel, a redeemer, someone who restores the previously existing conditions. When your husband Elimelech died and you left Judah and went to Moab, you had land here, the ancestral land, but you just left it. This man Boaz is a kinsman, and he has the right to buy back that land and make sure buy it for you, make sure it gets back to you. He's restoring the previously existing situation where Naomi and Elimelech owned land in Judah. And he can do that. And so we'll have land and we'll have our own fields and we'll be able to feed ourselves and everything will be wonderful. And you just found the right guy. I want you to, how shall I put this delicately, make nice on Boaz. I want you to let him know that you seek his protection, his rights under law to help you and me, says Naomi. And the way I want you to do this, it's harvest time. He'll be eating and drinking by the end of the harvest. He'll be feeling pretty good and need a nap. He'll sleep right outside in the great outdoors in the fresh air and the smell of new moon grain, which is a gorgeous smell, new moon hay, new moon grass, a gorgeous smell. And he's going to be feeling a little tipsy, but he's going to take a nap or go to sleep for the night. I want you to find out where he is sleeping. I want you to lie down next to him. First, gussy up, make yourself very attractive. And you go find him, lie down next to his feet. And how is he sleeping? He's sleeping like everybody else in his robes, like a kaftan, not with a blanket. And so you take the flap of his kaftan that they're covering his feet, lift it up, and put it over your feet. This is a symbolic legal gesture. And what you're saying is, I seek your protection under law. It may be saying more, it may be saying less. I had a wonderful senior citizen as a student in Hunter College in New York City. And Rose Levine, love that woman. And I moved to Florida when I retired. And who do I find down here in Florida with her husband? Rose Levine. She used to sit in on my classes, my advanced Hebrew classes, back in New York. And I started giving lectures at FAU in Jupiter, and there she is. And it was wonderful, just wonderful. Well, she and I had a running argument. The argument was when Ruth laid down next to Boaz and put the bottom hem, the flap of the hem of the kaftan over her, she was signaling more than just a legal status. She was importuning a sexual liaison. And I argued that there are many ways of saying people having sexual relations in the Hebrew Bible. And why didn't they just come out and say it if that's what was happening? Why did they use this strange phraseology of uncovering your legs from the kaftan and taking that corner of the kaftan, the bottom hems, and putting it over mine? I said it was a legal gesture. It was meant to be a legal gesture. Boaz would have understood it as such. Ruth had obviously been taught by Naomi that that's what it was. Ruth was not told by Naomi, go sleep with Boaz. No. But she and I fought maybe 5 or 6 years on that particular issue, debating back and forth, back and forth. She's gone to her eternal rest, and so we can't argue anymore. But she was a wonderful part of my life. Rose Levine, her memory is a blessing to me, and I'm sure to many others. Okay, she does that. And Boaz says, I see you want me to be the Goel, the redeemer of your property. And he doesn't have to have had sex with her in order to be a Goel. He has to be a kinsman of Naomi and Elimelech, the deceased Elimelech. So he says, I see you want my protection under law, and you want me to act the Goel on behalf of your family, Naomi, my kinsperson, and I'm willing to do so. There's one problem. In terms of the line of succession, there's one person who's ahead of me who has the right of redeeming Naomi's land and making sure it gets back to her. And if this individual gives up his right to redeem, then I will redeem the land for you and for Naomi, and you'll be back as you were before the famine and before the death of Elimelech and before the death of the sons. Very good. Boaz goes to the public square and sees the Goel, namely the kinsman who has the priority in the right to redeem the land. Why is that such an important thing? In ancient Israel, land was very much tied up with your family, with your tribe. You didn't just sell and buy and sell and buy land. The land was not to be alienated from its original owners, because there was a symbolism there. This was the land that God gave to the people of Israel, tribe by tribe, clan by clan, family by family, individual by individual. And so if you wanted to have another field, an extra field, so you had twice the produce, what are you going to do? You can't buy it. You can't willfully alienate the land from its original owner. But here's land that's up for grabs because the original owner has sort of stepped aside. It's a wonderful opportunity. And so you should think that the kinsman, the Goel, would rush at the opportunity of taking over the land of Naomi and Elimelech. Well, Boaz comes to the square and says, well, you have the right to be a Goel for Naomi. The only thing is, when you do that, you are also assuming responsibility for this Moabite daughter-in-law who was so faithful and accompanied Naomi back from Moab to Judah. And you have to support her and look after her, maybe even marry her. And the Goel, the one who has the right, says, I can't do it. I have too many responsibilities. It's enough to take care of my own property. I can't assume any more responsibilities. I pass over the right. Well, obviously, the kicker was he would have loved to have the land, but he doesn't want the responsibility for Ruth. And Boaz was counting on that. And so the road is open now. The way is open for Boaz to be the Goel, the redeemer of the land that once belonged to Naomi, restore it to Naomi, and it's going to be. And they eventually do get married, Boaz and Ruth, and they do consummate the marriage. I'm a wicked person. I used to tell my students that to consummate the marriage means after the ceremony at the dinner to serve a clear broth, and that's to consummate the marriage. They listened, they wrote. Yes, wicked person. Anyway, no consomme for us. This is the story. Now, what's going on? The theme of this story could be summed up by one word: chesed. Chesed. There have been several doctoral dissertations written trying to define the exact meaning and significance of the word chesed. I would translate it an act of loving kindness, showing an act of loving kindness, meaning it's more than just kindness, it's kindness with quite a dose of love. It's when you are devoted to another person above and beyond the requirements of law, above and beyond the requirements of custom or duty. You're doing it because of the goodness of your heart. And that's the feeling that runs through this story, are multiple acts of chesed. Let me give you some examples. When Naomi says to her daughters-in-law, while they're still in Moab, go back to your families, build a life for yourselves. Hanging around with an old lady, it's not going to get you anything. You should look out for yourselves. It's nice that you want to do it, but it's really not fair to you. By her releasing them from any obligation to her as daughters-in-law, that's an act of chesed. She doesn't have to do that. It would be certainly to her advantage to be escorted back to Judah one day in the company of these two women, rather than have to travel on her own, which was quite a dangerous undertaking at times. But she did it. She released them from their obligation. That was chesed. Ruth showed chesed to Naomi by saying, whither thou goest, I shall go. Your people shall be my people. Your God shall be my God. I'm not leaving you. Boaz showed Ruth chesed when, once he found out what a wonderful person and a loyal person she was to the family, special rights in gleaning, and told them, hey, when you harvest the grain and you see Ruth coming, drop extra stuff, make sure there's extra, and so that when she goes home, she's got quite a bountiful day's worth of gleaning. Do that for her, and he make sure that she could eat with the other gleaners. She's a stranger after all, and have a meal. He shows chesed. Boaz shows chesed to Ruth, who had shown chesed to Naomi, who had shown chesed to her daughters-in-law. Now Boaz shows chesed to the family of Naomi when he is eager to become the Goel, the Redeemer, and he's pushed the other guy out of the way who had priority, wanting to do this for them and to accept the responsibility for taking care of Ruth. This is an act of chesed. Ruth, on her part, shows chesed to Boaz, and he says so. What a chesed you're showing me. You could have anyone you wanted, a lovely young lady like yourself as a husband here in Judah, but you choose myself. I'm not a young man. You're doing it so that I could be your goel and I could help restore the whole family. You want to marry me for the good of the family, Naomi's family. Okay, well, this is chesed. It's interesting in this story, God does not appear in this story, but the effects of the guiding hand of divine providence, that divine overlooking of human affairs, the effects of the guiding hand of divine providence are evident throughout the story. Now, this guiding hand gives people and situations a nudge in the right direction. This guiding hand of divine providence is not working strings on a marionette, making a mere puppet and a creature without will or freedom of will out of Boaz and out of Naomi. And yeah, the way divine providence works throughout biblical narratives, stories, is that it puts people in the right situations where their actions, just being themselves, just being who they are, following their own instincts, but they're going to be put in situations where their actions, just being who they are and acting the way they usually act, will bring about results that conform to an overarching divine plan. Okay, I want to go back to the story now and just point out some of the areas in which divine providence is at work, even though God as a character does not appear in the story. One way is through the mentioning of famine. When you say there's a famine in the land, you're saying there's a drought. Now, when you're saying there's a drought, you're saying the rains have been withheld. The way it was understood in biblical Israel is that God gives the gift of rains, or if need be, withholds the gift of rains. And so when you hear there's a famine in the land, you're hearing God withheld the rains, caused a drought, and the drought caused a famine. That's a way of letting gentle reader know that God's will, God's plan is being set into action. Because in the Bible, when there is the famine motif, when you are told there's a famine in the land, it's usually for always the same reason, to cause movement, geographical movement. In this case, Naomi and her daughters-in-law move from Judah to Moab. How about in the story of Joseph? Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, if you remember. Now, how is the family ever going to be reunited? The only way is if you get the family of Jacob from square one to square two, from Canaan, the land of Israel, where they're living, down into Egypt. Well, how are you going to do that? You are going to cause a famine, and because of the famine, they're going to migrate down into Egypt to buy grain, because in Egypt, rainfall is not as critical at all as it is in the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, and the whole ecology is different. The grain, the produce, the harvests in Egypt come because of the annual flooding of the Nile when it overflows its banks. It doesn't come from rainfall. Very, very, how shall I say, difficult rainfall. So they go down to Egypt. Just like Naomi and her daughters-in-law go from Judah to Moab. The famine motif is introduced into a story to explain and give a reason for moving the chief characters from square A to square B, because in square B, things are going to happen that ultimately will lead to the fulfillment of a divine plan. That's one way of showing divine providence working. Another is through the use of symbolic names. Symbolic names. Elimelech means my God is king. Well, maybe he's called that because as the first words of the story of Ruth tell us that this is during the period of the judges, namely before the period of the monarchy. So there's no king. So if there's no king, when you call yourself Elimelech, you're saying, God is my king, because there aren't any other kings around, and because God is ultimately the King of Kings. How about Naomi? My pleasantness is what her name means. It starts off, she's very pleasant. She's got a family. Her sons are married. Everything's lovely. But the Naomi, her pleasantness turns to bitterness when her husband dies and her sons die, and the two daughters-in-law are left as widows. And she actually says, why do you call me Naomi, my pleasantness? Nothing pleasant about my life right now. Well, if you wait till the end of the story, all's well that ends well. It'll be very pleasant once again. How about Machlon and Chilion, the two sons? Boy, if you're going to have children, don't use those names. Machlon is related to the word for illness. Chilion is related to the word of coming to an end. So, you've got two bouncing babies, and you call one sickly and the other terminal. Not good. But the point is, it announces their destiny. From the names Machlon and Chilion, you should be able to guess, if your Hebrew's in good shape, that they're not going to be around very long, and indeed they die in short order. I'll just tell you that the musical director on the Jack Benny show, which I still watch in reruns, his first name was Mahlon, Mahlon, which is exactly the biblical name Machlon. And I think if they knew what that name symbolized, namely illness, I think they would have found him another name. My point being that they still use, surprisingly enough, the word Machlon. Chilion I've not seen as a name. But all right. Now, Machlon and Chilion married two women, Moabite women. One was called Orpah. Ultimately, even after she said, I'll stay with you, I'll stick with you, Naomi, I'm your loyal daughter-in-law, Naomi was able to convince her to return home. And so she did. She returned home. She turned her back, as it were, and headed back to her family. Back of the neck is Oref. Orpah is related to that word, and it's telling you she's going to be the one who turns back and shows the back of her neck as she leaves Naomi. Ruth means overflowing. Like in Psalm 23, my cup overflows. She is a symbol of plenty at a time when there's famine and drought all around. She is plenty. At a time of death of kinsmen and of successors and of your children, she will provide new life, children. She is the symbol of overflowing plenty, who acts with chesed in overflowing with her gifts to the family. Having such symbolic names that coincide with the fate of these individuals suggests to the gentle Israelite listener to this story that divine providence is at work. Another way, when human behavior mirrors and parallels divine behavior, and the two are in sync, namely, God shows chesed to his people, and Ruth showed chesed, Naomi shows chesed, Boaz shows chesed. They are acting in a way that a good, benevolent God acts. And when the two come so close to one another, that's perhaps a sign that divine providence is working to make things turn out right. Let me give you an example. I gave you the example of chesed. God shows chesed, our story tells us, to the family of Naomi. Why? Because the family of Naomi, those two daughters-in-law, were willing to stick it out with her through thick and thin after their own husbands were gone, her sons, and she stuck with they were willing to stick, and that's exactly the word that's used, to stick with their mother-in-law, to stick like glue. And in fact, the verb that's used in modern Hebrew, from that verb you get the word for glue. Stick like glue. Well, when Boaz finds out that this is Ruth gleaning in his fields, and she was so good to your kinswoman Naomi, and she came back from Moab, which was her home, to just stick close to her mother-in-law. What does he say to her? He says, oh, help yourself. Hang around the other gleaners so that you know how to do it and you know how to get the most for your efforts. No. He says to her, stick. Same word. Stick in Hebrew. Stick with the gleaning girls, and they'll tell you what to do, and they'll help you, and they'll make sure you get what you need, and water to drink and food to eat. Stick by them. So she who stuck, Ruth, will be allowed now to stick. That's measure for measure justice, what we call poetic justice. She who stuck will be allowed to stick, using the exact same word to show the direct correspondence between the good deed that you did and the good deed that takes place with respect to you. Okay, how about coincidence? When you find coincidences in a biblical story, introduced into a biblical story, they're usually too coincidental to be coincidental. And if they're not coincidences, real coincidences, but coincidences in quotes, you know that divine providence is giving history, human history, a little nudge in the right direction. Now, Naomi and Ruth come back to Judah after they leave Moab, when they hear that the famine is over, the drought is over, and they're harvesting. And Naomi sends out Ruth to do some gleaning if she can, so that they can eat. They're starving. They have no food. And what does the text say? Ruth the Moabite goes out and she's gleaning in the field to find food for them. And her happening happened. It just so happened that her happenstance happened. One translation of the Book of Ruth says, as luck would have it. Well, there's no luck in the Bible. If something takes place, it's because human beings did it or God did it. But there's no luck. No mazel. That's a pagan concept and a pagan religious idea. Anyway, it just so happens she's in Judah. She doesn't know one place from another. She's a Moabitess. Where's the first place she ends up? In the field of Boaz, who's a kinsman of Naomi and who has the right to redeem Naomi's land if he so chooses, to help restore their fortunes. Now, when Naomi sees Ruth come back and finds out she was in the field of Boaz, says, look, I want you to really go and lie down next to him and perform this legal gesture of extending a part of his clothing over you as if you're under his raiment. You're under his protective clothing. You're under his legal protection, as he will be your goel, your redeemer, the one restoring your former fortunes. And isn't it nice that this takes place at the harvest time? Because if it weren't the harvest time, Ruth is going to have no idea how to find Boaz. But because it's harvest time and the owners and the harvesters are eating and drinking and then sort of conking out by a pile of hay to catch a snooze, she knows right where to find him. She's been in his field. She knows where they were reaping. And so she knows right where to go to find Boaz, where she can fulfill Naomi's request of her. Okay, that's coincidences that aren't coincidences. And now comes the pièce de résistance. The use of words in a story. The use of words to drive home the theme, to drive home the message of the story. Now, we've already seen that the word chesed appears more than once, so that you know, keep your eye on the bouncing ball. The chesed that is shown is chesed that will be returned to the one who has shown it. That's repeated, but nothing like the verb to return. In the first chapter alone of the Book of Ruth, the Scroll of Ruth, this word to return in Hebrew, lashuv, shuv, 12 times. In a very short chapter, this same word repeats. to the point where it hits you over the head with a sledgehammer. Get it? This is a story about returns. That things are going to return back to the good situations they were before the story began. Things are going to turn back. And when all these turning backs take place, after 12 times repeating the verb in a short, very short chapter, you know that the one who's causing these returns has to be God, because there are just too many returns going on, even though God is not mentioned as a character participating in the story. There's a nice word literary critics use, Leitwort. Leitwort, a key word, a leading word, a word that repeats over and over in the story so as to let you know this is the theme of the story. This is what the story is all about. The Leitwort, Leitwort. It's German, Leitwort. Okay, returned. Let's go through the returns. Chapter 1, verse 6. Naomi started out with her daughters-in-law to return from the plains of Moab, for there she had heard that Adonai attended to the needs of his people, providing food for them. This is right before she says to them, why come with me? Why not go home and build a life for yourselves? But how is it phrased? That they're all returning from Moab to Judah, from whence they came. All right. Verse 7. She, together with her 2 daughters-in-law, took to the road to return to the land of Judah. Well, I think that was clear from the immediately preceding verse, but again, you're going to be hit over the head with this verb, shuv, to return. The same word, by the way, where we get teshuvah, repentance. Here it's in a very different sense. Here it's the physical sense of returning to the place from which you came. All right. Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, what do you want to stay with me? Each of you go, return to your mother's house here in Moab. Well, that's 3 times in 3 verses. You've got the verb return. They said to her, we shall return instead to you, with you to your people. Namely, we'll return with you as you return to Judah. But Naomi said, no, my daughters, you return to your homes. Why go with me? Can I still give birth to any more sons to be your husbands at my age? No, my daughters, return home. When they say, no, we want to stay by you, we're loyal to you, we love you. No, my daughters, she says, return home, again return. My lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of God is against me. Everything has been going wrong for me. Well, so far, yes. But return, return, return. Things are going to return to the good times if you just wait. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, and she returned to her people and showed the back of her neck, her oref, Orpah. By the way, it is from this verse that Oprah's name was given to her by her mother, Oprah. Even though it's Orpah, it came out as Oprah, And that's why we have Oprah Winfrey. Little footnote to history there. Then Naomi said to Ruth, "See, your sister-in-law Orpah has returned to her people and to her gods. Now you return like your sister-in-law," twice in one verse. Okay, now I'm up to verse 16, still in chapter 1. And Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you, to return home away from you." Okay, couple verses later. So Naomi returned home to Judah, and Ruth, her Moabite daughter-in-law, was with her. She, Ruth, was the one who returned from the plains of Moab. They arrived at Bethlehem just at the beginning of the barley harvest. Talk about a symbolic name. Bethlehem means house of food, Beit Lechem. Famine is over, drought is over, and where do they go? They go to Bethlehem, the house of food. Right. It's the harvest time. So return. What are these returns? From plenty to famine, and then a return back to plenty. In a more geographical sense, going from Judah in the west to Moab in the east, and then returning from Moab in the east to Judah in the west. This return is pointing to the theme of restoration. Restoration. All that has been lost is going to be returned down to the smallest detail. Let's see how it works. Naomi lost 2 sons. Well, they're dead. They can't be returned to her. But when Boaz and Ruth have their first child, the neighborhood women say, "Oh, how wonderful, a son is born to Naomi." The son was born to Ruth, right? Her with her husband Boaz. But they phrase it as if Naomi has a son again, a grandson, but a son again. Her fortunes have been restored. They have returned to the good times. Ruth lost a husband. Well, the husband is returned to her in the form of Boaz. She is given a new husband. And not only that, he's not just a husband. The neighborhood women, they act like a kind of Greek chorus, commenting on the action. The neighborhood women say, "See how God has shown chesed, how God has given you this Boaz who will be a restorer." Meshiv, from the root shuv, to return. He'll be a restorer of Naomi's life breath. It's like bringing Naomi back to life again. Remember, she said, "Don't call me Naomi, my pleasantness. You should call me my bitterness." Well, now she can be called Naomi, my pleasantness. A son has been returned to her, as it were, and a husband has been restored to her daughter-in-law, as it were. Not the same person, obviously, but a restoration. This tale, the tale of Ruth, is very much like what goes on in the book of Job, in the preface and in the epilogue to Job. The poems of Job, the book of Job, are framed by a folk tale. And in the folk tale, everything Job has is lost. His children, his livestock, his health, everything is lost. And by the end of the story, by the end chapter of the book of Job, he lost such and such number of sons and such numbers of daughters. Their return, one for one, one for one, one for one, returned, restored. So the book of Job is a restoration tale, just like the Scroll of Ruth is a restoration tale, a tale of returning. There's another story, the story of Judah and Tamar. Judah, the son of Jacob, marries a woman and has 3 sons. The first son marries a woman, and for some reason we don't know why, that son's wife dies. So, excuse me, not the wife dies, the husband dies. The husband dies. So you've got this daughter surviving, and her husband has just died, one of Judah's sons. So she's passed along to the next son in order. And for some unexplained reason, that son dies. The explanation is clearer in the second case. He was trying to get out of having to support his deceased brother's widow, and he found a way of doing it that displeased God, and so he dies. So you've got this this daughter-in-law of Judah. Her name is Tamar, and Tamar is a symbolic name. Tamar is the date palm, which in biblical language and literature is a symbol of fertility. The date palm, it not only gives you the fruit, the dates, but every part of the palm can be used in your household. It's the gift that keeps on giving. And Tamar is fruitfulness with a capital fruit. All right. There's a third son that you could pass Tamar on to, but Judah, the father-in-law, says, good God, I have 3 sons. I've given this same woman to 2. She's got to be a jinx. As soon as my sons get into the bedroom with her, it's over. So I'm not going to be so fast to give her my 3rd son, the youngest. He's young. So Tamar is told by Judah, go home to your father's house and you stay there. And when my 3rd son comes of age, we'll call you. Don't call us, we'll call you. You've heard that before. Well, the phone doesn't ring, and Tamar is home. She's got this wonderful slimline phone, and it's really very stylish, goes with the decor, but it doesn't ring. So she takes matters into her all too capable hands, and she disguises herself as a prostitute. She hears that Judah her father-in-law is on his way to the sheep shearing, and she knows where that's going to be. So she stations herself along the road, and sure enough, Judah comes by. He sees this woman. His own wife has since died. He's been without a woman, a sexual companion, for some time, and here he sees this woman who is a sexual functionary. By the way, I hasten to add, there is no law against prostitution in the entire Hebrew Bible. It is not considered the kind of profession that any father wants his daughter to go into, but it's not forbidden. It's not a sin, not at all, which is a far more enlightened point of view, in my opinion, than this Anglo-Saxon uptight culture in which we live. Because if a woman's husband dies and she hasn't got any brothers and her father is dead, who is going to support her? She'll starve to death. And so prostitution is a way that she can provide for herself. It is not considered a sin. Oh, I'm off? Oh, I'm not off. All right. Okay. All I want to say is that Tamar never gets to the boudoir of the third son, but the so-called prostitute has relations with her father-in-law. A child is born, right? A child is born, and in fact, two children are born. Get it? Two children were lost, and two children are born through this strange union of a daughter-in-law disguised as a prostitute and her unwitting father-in-law. Two lost, two gained, a return story. And then we are told at the end of the book of Job that the son that was born to Boaz and Ruth, his name was Obed. Obed had a son named Yishai, Jesse. Jesse had a son, David, namely from the union of this loyal Moabite daughter-in-law and this gracious Boaz who shows chesed and receives chesed. From that union comes the future David Melech Yisrael, David the king of Israel, and according to later Jewish belief, from the same descent will come not only the kings of Judah, but at the end of time, the Messiah will be born from the house of David. Losses and returns, losses and returns. And when you have a bookkeeper as good as God, the losses are uncanny in the way they are matched one for one by that which is gained. Your liabilities are turned into assets, and there's only one bookkeeper that good. Thank you very much. I appreciate so much your joining us for seeing how the language and the style and the repetitions and the special choice of vocabulary, symbolic words, and coincidences, how by famines, how putting these things into the story really tell you what the story is about, the theme of the story, the meaning of the story. Thank you very much. And if you haven't done so already, as soon as this tape finishes, take out your Bible, do yourself a great pleasure, and read the story of Ruth. You'll feel better after you've read it than you did when you started. Thank you again. I am finished, but I don't know how to turn this off. So, heard any good jokes lately? Doreen! Oh, Doreen! Come, Doreen. I need to be shut off. Yes, turn me off. I have no idea. All done.